The shuttle hit the upper atmosphere at 0312 local time, and Marcus Vajic did not look out the window. He had learned not to look out windows on landing approaches. It was a habit he'd picked up in the refugee processing centers on Callisto Station, where the windows faced the shipyards. And the shipyards meant work, and work meant something the other boys his age had that Marcus did not. Fathers who came home. His father had not come home from the Kerrigan Belt Survey mission when Marcus was 9. His mother worked double shifts in the station's hydroponic bays and smelled always of iron-rich nutrient solution and exhaustion. So Marcus had learned early to keep his head down, keep his eyes on the floor, and move through the world like something the world had not yet noticed. He was 16 when the Veth came, not 16 when they arrived in system. That was 3 years before his birth, when the first long-range telescopes caught the signature of their transition wake, crossing the heliopause, a smear of exotic radiation that the astronomers argued over for 6 months before the consensus settled into the word that changed everything: artificial. Marcus was 16 when the Veth made their first surface contact, setting down in a meadow outside a small agricultural township on Ganymede's southern shelf, and the first human to approach the Veth ship was a hydroponic bay inspector named Sela Orindu, who walked out into that meadow carrying a clipboard and a thermos of coffee because she had a morning audit scheduled and was not going to let the end of the world interfere with paperwork. She survived the encounter. She even got a handshake out of it, though the Veth appendage in question was less a hand than a cluster of semi-rigid tendrils the color of old bruises. And the gesture was not a human invention the Veth were imitating, but something they had independently evolved as a formal greeting which the xenolinguists said later was either deeply reassuring or deeply unsettling, depending on your philosophy. The Veth were not interested in war. They were interested in something worse. Marcus had been a quiet, unremarkable student at Callisto Station Secondary when the Veth announced what they called the assessment. Every inhabited human settlement, every station and moon, and marginal colony, and pressure-sealed habitat cluster would be subject to review. The Veth had been observing humanity for what they described, with a precision that the UN Diplomatic Corps found either admirable or insulting, as 41 of their own orbital cycles, which translated to approximately 72 standard years, which meant they had been watching since before the first human left Earth orbit, watching and cataloging and making judgments. The assessment was the formalization of those judgments. The Veth would evaluate each human community. Communities deemed viable would be permitted to continue. Communities deemed non-viable would be relocated. No one asked what happened after relocation. The Veth did not volunteer the information. The silence around that question was the loudest thing Marcus had ever heard. He did not look out the window on the landing approach, because looking out the window meant seeing the green skin of the forest that covered most of the moon below, and the forest meant thinking about what he was carrying. And thinking about what he was carrying made his hands shake, and his hands could not shake for what came next. The case was a rectangular block of matte black polymer, 20 centimeters by 15 by 8, with a biometric lock keyed to his left thumb. It did not look remarkable. That was the point. The Veth had inspectors at every landing pad now, pale-eyed and unreadable in their layered silica garments, and they scanned for weapons, for encrypted drives, for anything that might constitute what they called organizational interference, which meant resistance, which meant anything humans might use to push back. They did not scan for books. They had made clear in the first months of the assessment that they found human recording media, printed text on durable substrate, to be an amusing anachronism, like finding a species that still communicated by drum. The case contained a book. Marcus was counting on the Veth, finding that funny. The shuttle settled onto the pad with a hydraulic sigh, and Marcus picked up the case, stood, and walked toward the hatch with the careful, unhurried stride of someone who was not important enough to stop. Arvin's station occupied a pressurized dome set into the northern ridgeline of the moon they were calling Silvara 4 in the colonial registry, though the original survey crew had called it something unprintable, and the local population called it simply the Green, because of the forest that covered every landmass from equator to pole in a canopy, so dense that, from orbit, it looked like a single living skin. The forest was remarkable. Xenobotanists from 6 different institutions had requested access. The Veth had denied every request. They had not explained why, but they were very thorough about it. And that was another silence Marcus had learned to listen to. The dome held approximately 4,000 people. It had been viable under the assessment, but only provisionally. The Veth assessment team leader, a figure the colonists called the Watcher, though no one had been brave enough to ask for a name, had given them a secondary review window, 90 standard days to demonstrate continued viability under revised criteria the Veth had declined to specify in advance. It was an unannounced test, and everyone in the dome knew it, and the specific texture of their fear was something Marcus could taste in the recycled air even before the hatch opened. He stepped out onto the pad, and the Veth inspector scanned him from 4 meters away without moving, its opalescent sensory cluster rotating through frequencies Marcus couldn't see, but could feel as a faint prickling along his jaw. It looked at the case. It looked at Marcus. He held its gaze, not defiantly, just steadily, the way you learned to hold the gaze of things that had power over you when you grew up in the processing centers. The inspector looked away. Marcus walked into the dome. His contact was a woman named Dr. Tessely Mern, 43, former professor of xenolinguistics at the Callisto Academy. Had reclassified academic institutions as non-essential infrastructure and closed them. She was waiting for him in the dome's secondary processing bay, which smelled of machine oil and old coffee, and she was wearing the expression of someone who had been making the calculation between hope and catastrophic disappointment for so long that the two had fused into a single thing. "You have it," she said. It was not a question. "I have it." Marcus set the case on the table between them and pressed his thumb to the lock. The case opened. Inside, cushioned in dense foam, was a book, hardbound, the substrate that was not quite paper and not quite polymer, the cover a deep, unremarkable brown, with no text on the outside. The pages, when you held them at the right angle under the right light, showed text in a script that was not any human language and was not any Veth language, and was, according to the 3 separate analysts who had examined it before Marcus took custody, something else entirely, something old, something that had been written before either species existed. Dr. Mern exhaled slowly through her nose. "You weren't followed." "I'm not interesting enough to follow," Marcus said. She almost smiled. "You're about to become very interesting." "Tell me about the forest," Marcus said. So she did. The forest of Silvara 4 was not just forest. The xenobotanists who had been denied access had still managed remote spectroscopy, and what the spectroscopy showed was a root network so complex and so extensively cross-linked that the entire canopy of the moon was, in a structural sense, a single organism, not a metaphor, not an approximation. One organism distributed across a planetary surface with something that the biologists' models described, with increasing embarrassment and decreasing confidence, as a central processing node located in the deep forest approximately 40 kilometers from Arvin Station's dome wall. The Veth knew about the node. They had been present when the original survey team found it, had, in fact, been watching the survey team from the tree line, which was one of the reasons the xenobotanists suspected the Veth's interest in Silvara 4 predated humanity's arrival by a considerable margin. The node was also why the assessment of Arvin Station had come with conditions. The Veth had not been explicit about this, but Dr. Mern had spent 4 years listening to the Veth's diplomatic language, with the specific attention of someone who has learned to read the negative space in what a powerful entity chooses not to say. And her reading was this. The Veth wanted the node. They believed it was theirs by right of discovery, or by right of technological superiority, or by some ethical framework. that mapped poorly onto human concepts of property, but that resolved, in practice, to the same thing. And Arvin Station was in the way. The book, according to the three analysts who had examined it, was a key, not a metaphor. Not an approximation. The organism in the forest had an interface, ancient, dormant, waiting. The book contained the activation sequence, the specific harmonic codes that would wake the interface and, if the analysts were right, give the user accesses to whatever the organism had been designed to do. Designed by whom? And for what purpose? Were questions the analysts had opinions about, and Marcus had chosen not to read those opinions. Because the weight of them would make it harder to do what he had to do. He was 16 and scared, and the only person small enough and quiet enough and forgettable enough to get through the VETH inspections with a polymer case that the inspectors had dismissed as amusing. The Watcher comes back in 9 days, Dr. Mern said. When it delivers its final assessment, there will be VETH enforcement vessels in the system. Not now, 9 days from now. So we have 9 days. You have 9 days. I can't go into the forest. The VETH have motion sensor arrays in the tree line. They're calibrated for my biometric signature and the signatures of everyone in this dome over the age of 18. They update the registry every 48 hours. She looked at him. You're 16. Your biometric isn't in the registry yet. Marcus looked at the book. I've never fired a weapon, he said. The book isn't a weapon, she said. It's a language. What does it say? We don't fully know. But the analysts agree on the first sequence. The first sequence is a greeting. She paused. Whatever is in that forest has been waiting for a very long time to be spoken to. We think it's been waiting specifically for someone who doesn't already know what it is. Marcus thought about that. Why? Because, Doctor, Mern said carefully, knowledge creates expectation. And expectation creates interference. The organism's interface, if the analysts are right, requires a mind that's genuinely open, not trained, not prepared, not already full of what it's supposed to find. You mean it needs someone ignorant? I mean it needs someone unencumbered. Marcus picked up the book. The cover was warm under his fingers, which was not physically possible. The temperature in the storage case was ambient, the same as the room. And yet the warmth was undeniable. The way the warmth of a held hand is undeniable, even when you have told yourself you don't need it. When do I leave? He said. Tonight, she said, before the next registry update. The forest began 40 meters past the dome's outer pressure seal, and it began all at once. Not a gradual thickening of scrub brush, but an immediate, total commitment to itself, like a wall made of living things. The trees were not like any trees Marcus knew from the archives. They were taller by a factor of 3, their bark a deep violet gray that shimmered when the moon's dim sun caught it at an angle, their canopy interlocking so completely overhead that the light below was a diffuse, sourceless green that made everything look like it was happening underwater. The undergrowth was sparse. The root network was everywhere, visible where it broke the surface as smooth gray cables thicker than Marcus's thigh, and the roots were warm too. He could feel the warmth through the soles of his boots. He had a compass. He had a headlamp that he kept off, because the VETH arrays would read the photon signature. He had 3 days of concentrated rations, a water filter, a basic medkit, and the book in its case clipped to his pack with a carabiner. He had a handwritten note from Dr. Mern with the coordinates of the node, and 3 sentences of instruction. Walk northeast. Follow the root network when you find it. Don't stop when you're afraid. He was afraid immediately. He found this clarifying. The first night in the forest, Marcus did not sleep, not because of the sounds, though there were sounds. The forest was full of them, low resonant pulses that he could feel more in his chest than his ears, a deep systolic rhythm that made him think of the word heartbeat before he could stop himself. He didn't sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Watcher's assessment form on the dome's public board, the columns of criteria the VETH had used to evaluate the colony, and the column he kept coming back to was the one labeled cultural adaptability. Arvin Station had scored low. The annotation read, "Limited capacity for paradigm revision under existential pressure. Tendency toward historical pattern reinforcement." Marcus had been standing outside the admin office when he read it, had read it 4 times, and on the 4th reading had understood that what it meant was, these humans are like all the other humans. They will do what humans always do. They will not surprise us. He wanted, more than he had wanted almost anything, to be a surprise. He walked northeast. He followed the routes. On the 2nd day, he found the first of the markers. They were not human-made. Not the dome's survey markers, or any other artifact from the colonial infrastructure. They were organic. Nodes in the root network where multiple routes converged and braided together into structures that were almost but not quite geometric, like a concept of regularity that had been translated imperfectly into biological medium. Each one was slightly different. Each one, when Marcus pressed his hand against it, produced a faint vibration that traveled up his arm and settled somewhere behind his sternum. He opened the book for the first time on the 2nd day, in a clearing where 3 enormous trees had fallen in some ancient storm. And the light came through the gap in a column that was solid with floating particles of something that was not pollen. The book opened to a page he had not chosen. The script on the page was the same undecipherable character set the analysts had photographed. But as Marcus looked at it, something shifted. Not in the script, in him, like a key turning not in a lock but in the person holding the key, reorienting something interior that had always pointed in the wrong direction. He understood, in the way you understand something in a dream, that the first sequence was not a greeting in the sense of hello. It was a greeting in the sense of recognition. "I see you. I have been waiting. You are not nothing." He said it aloud. The sounds came out of him before he was sure he knew how to make them. A combination of sub-vocalized, vibration and ordinary speech, and something. A third thing, a resonance generated in his chest. At a frequency, the book seemed to have taught his body, without telling his mind. The forest did not respond dramatically. There was no light show, no rumbling ground, no dramatic opening of a hidden door. What happened was that the background rhythm of the forest, that deep systolic pulse he had been feeling in his chest since he entered the tree line, shifted very slightly toward him. Like something enormous and very old turning its attention in his direction with the unhurried certainty of something that has all the time in the world and has decided that now, finally, is the time. Marcus kept walking. He reached the node on the 3rd day, 2 hours before dawn by his watch, and he sat down on the largest of the surface roots and ate half a ration bar and drank water from his filter bottle and looked at what was in front of him for a long time. The node was a clearing, approximately 200 meters in diameter. In the center of the clearing, the root network converged into a structure that rose from the ground to a height of perhaps 6 meters. A living column, the roots coiled and fused into something that was undeniably architectural, with what Marcus could only describe as alcoves. Concave spaces in the root column's surface, each the right size to stand in, each with a configuration of braided root tendrils at head height that looked, unmistakably, like hands raised in offering. The column pulsed with the same rhythm he had been feeling for 3 days. But here, at the source, the rhythm was a physical thing, pressing against his ribs with each beat like a second heartbeat trying to sync with his own. He could also see, in the pre-dawn darkness, the Veth. There were 3 of them at the far edge of the clearing. They were not hiding. They stood in the characteristic stillness of the Veth at rest, their sensory clusters dim and inward turned. And they were positioned at equal intervals around the clearing's perimeter, like sentinels who had been standing there long enough to have forgotten why they were standing. They had not reacted to Marcus's arrival. Either they had not detected him, or they had detected him and decided he was not interesting. He was counting, as he had counted at the landing pad, on the second option. He recognized one of them from the dome, the Watcher. The Veth assessment team leader was taller than the other 2, by perhaps 15 centimeters. Its silica garments layered in the asymmetrical pattern That, Dr. Mern had explained, indicated senior authority in the Veth hierarchy. Its sensory cluster was a deeper gold than the others, the hue of old cognition. It had been standing in that clearing, Marcus realized, for longer than 3 days. Long enough that the forest roots had grown slightly around its feet, the slow, persistent hospitality of a plant that will eventually consume anything that stays still long enough. The Watcher knew what the node was. It had been waiting for the 90-day assessment window to close, at which point the colony would be declared non-viable, at which point the enforcement vessels would arrive, at which point Arvin Station's 4,000 people would be relocated to wherever the Veth relocated non-viable communities, and the forest and its interface, and the ancient dormant power in the node's root column would become, quietly and completely, the Veths. Marcus looked at the book. He thought about Dr. Mern's note. Don't stop when you're afraid. He stood up, walked to the nearest alcove, stepped into it, and let the root tendrils touch his hands. What happened next Marcus spent the rest of his life failing to adequately describe. And the failure was not from lack of trying. He wrote about it 3 times across 3 decades, in 3 very different books. And the closest he ever came was in the second one, where he wrote, "It was like being asked a question you have always known the answer to, but never been asked. And asking of it releases something in you that has been pressing as the inside of your chest for your entire life, waiting for permission." The organism, the single vast distributed intelligence that had spent more years than the Veth, had been a spacefaring civilization lying dormant under the forest canopy, dreaming its slow vegetable dreams, did not speak to Marcus in language. It spoke in the way weather speaks, in the way deep water speaks, in the way any sufficiently large and old thing speaks, when it finally has the attention of something small enough and new enough to listen, without already knowing what it means. It knew about the Veth. It had been aware of the Veth's presence for what Marcus understood, from the rushing sense of vast time the organism conveyed, as a geological eye blink, 10,000 years, give or take, which to an organism that had been growing and thinking in this forest for something in the range of 60 million years was the kind of interval you might use to measure the time between deciding to do something and actually doing it. It had been waiting, the organism is conveyed, for the right interface, not a Veth interface. The Veth had tried. Centuries ago, when they had first found this moon in their early expansion phase, they had tried to access the node. The organism had reviewed their architecture, biological, cognitive, social, and declined. The Veth's minds were extraordinary. The organism did not dispute this. They were among the most sophisticated cognitive structures it had encountered in 60 million years of paying attention. But they had a quality the organism had learned, over 60 million years, to recognize as dangerous in a potential partner. They had already decided what everything was for. Humans the organism conveyed, with what Marcus could only interpret as something resembling dry amusement, had not. Marcus stood in the alcove, with the root tendrils warm against his palms, and thought about being 16 scared, and not interesting enough to stop at checkpoints, and thought about his mother, smelling of iron solution, and exhaustion, and thought about Sela Orindu, walking into an alien meadow with a clipboard and a thermos, because she had an audit to finish, and he understood, in that moment, that the thing Dr. Mern had called unencumbered, and the Veth assessment had called limited capacity for paradigm revision, were in fact the same thing described by 2 minds, with 2 very different ideas about what was useful in the universe. He asked the organism, in the only way available to him, through the resonance the book had taught his body, and through whatever the organism was reading in his physiological state, his heart rate, the specific chemistry of his fear, and his determination, and his grief for a father who had not come home. He asked the organism what it could do. The organism told him. Marcus stood in the alcove for another 30 seconds, which was not enough time for what he had just learned to be fully processed, but was enough time for a 16-year-old who had grown up in the processing centers to make a decision he had already. without knowing it, made when he stepped out of the shuttle and held a Veth inspector's gaze without looking away. Then he turned around to face the Watcher. The Watcher's sensory cluster had come fully active. All three Veth in the clearing were oriented toward him now, their stillness replaced by the specific quality of attention the Veth brought to things they were trying to categorize. Marcus had seen that look before, in the assessment offices, in the landing pad, on the faces of creatures that had evaluated 41 of their own orbital cycles of human behavior, and arrived at a stable and comprehensive conclusion. They were categorizing him. He knew what category he was going into. He had spent his entire life in that category. He had a speech prepared. He had worked on it for 2 days while walking through the forest, refining it, trying different words, trying to find the version that said everything that needed to be said, with enough precision that a non-human intelligence would understand it. He had discarded 7 drafts. The 8th draft, which he had been fairly satisfied with, had also dissolved in the moment because words were the wrong tool for what was required. What was required was simpler and more difficult. He said, "You need to leave." The Watcher's sensory cluster adjusted. A sound emerged from the Veth that the translation earpiece Marcus was wearing, rendered as Query Plus, classification challenge, which was the Veth's formal linguistic gesture for indicating that a statement required clarification before it could be properly responded to. "This colony," Marcus said, "this moon, the forest and everything in it, you need to leave." The Watcher responded. The translation was, "You are a juvenile member of an assessed community whose viability determination is pending. You do not have standing to make territorial claims on behalf of—" "I'm not making a territorial claim," Marcus said. "I'm telling you what's going to happen." A pause. The specific quality of Veth attention shifted into something the earpiece's translation matrix didn't have a clean word for, a kind of patient incredulity. The way you might look at something small and fragile that has decided to be brave. "The organism in this forest," Marcus said, "has been here for approximately 60 million years. That's longer than your species has been using fire. It's been aware of your presence in this system for about 10,000 years. It has been evaluating whether you're a useful neighbor." He paused. "It has reached a conclusion." The Watcher did not respond immediately. This was unusual. The Veth were not, in Marcus's experience, prone to pauses. He continued. "The interface you tried to access 3,000 years ago, the node, this node, right here. You know what you did when you tried to access it? You showed it exactly what you were. You showed it a mind that had already decided what this forest was for, what it was worth, whether the things living near it had the right to stay." He held up the book. "The forest has been waiting for someone who hadn't decided yet. Someone who came here because they had no other choice, because 4,000 people they'd never met were going to be relocated somewhere no one would tell them about, and the tool anyone had was a book that no one fully understood." He felt his voice doing something he hadn't planned for it to do, steadying, dropping into a register that was not angry and not frightened, but something slower and heavier. "That's us. That's what humans are. We show up with tools we don't fully understand, for people we've never met, because the alternative is watching something wrong happen and not trying." The Watcher moved for the first time, not toward Marcus. It moved its sensory cluster, toward the root column, toward the node, and Marcus watched it run whatever the Veth equivalent of a diagnostic was. Watched it process what it was reading from the organism, and he watched the specific moment when the Veth's expression, if you could call the movement of a sensory cluster an expression, changed. The second Veth made a sound the earpiece rendered as, "The interface is active." The third Veth made a sound the earpiece rendered as, "To what degree?" The Watcher was silent for a long time. Long enough that the forest's pulse, which Marcus could still feel in his chest, seemed to be not just his heartbeat and the organism's, but something shared between them, a synchrony that the root tendrils had established in the alcove and had not released even after Marcus stepped away. He was still connected. He understood this in the way you understand something happening inside your own body. Not as an external event, but as an interior fact, quiet and irreversible. When the Watcher finally spoke, the translation was careful, formal, and precise in the way the Veth were always precise when they had just learned something that required recategorization. It said, "What terms does the forest require for peaceful cooperation?" Marcus thought about the question for a moment. "I'll have to ask," he said, and he turned back to the root column, pressed his palms to the warm braided roots, and began to learn what 60 million years of patient attention had to say about the terms for peaceful cooperation between very different kinds of minds. What followed was not a negotiation in any sense Marcus had trained for, because Marcus had not trained for anything. Dr. Mern had given him coordinates, and 3 sentences, and a book, and whatever came next he was making up as he went, which was either the ideal preparation for what was required or a catastrophic oversight depending on how you looked at it. And Marcus had decided, somewhere in the root column's warmth, to look at it the first way. The organism's terms were not complex. They were, in fact, so structurally simple that the complexity resided entirely in whether the Veth were capable of accepting them, which was not the same thing as whether the terms were reasonable, and was not the same thing as whether the Veth had the power to refuse them. The first term was this: the forest would not be studied, harvested, accessed, or interfaced with by Veth technology without the consent of the organism. The organism would be considered, for the purposes of all interspecies agreements in this system, a sovereign entity, not a resource, not an environment, a person, in the legal sense that the word had been used by every sufficient advanced civilization the organism had encountered across its 60 million years of paying attention, which turned out to be more civilizations than either humans or the Veth had suspected existed. Marcus conveyed this to the Watcher. There was a pause. The earpiece rendered the Watcher's response as, "The classification of non-mobile biological entities as sovereign persons is outside our current legal framework." "I know," Marcus said. "You'll need to revise it." Second term. Arvin Station and its population would be reclassified as viable, immediately and permanently, not as a concession or a favor, but as a recognition of fact. The colony existed in proximity to the organism, and the organism had chosen to permit this proximity, which under the organism's own ancient legal architecture, a legal architecture that predated both human and Veth law by roughly 59 million years, constituted a formal invitation. Guests of the organism were not subject to third-party assessment. They were, in the organism's guest right tradition, inviolate. The Watcher processed this for a very long time, long enough that the pre-dawn light began to gray into something that was not quite sunrise. The moon's sun was small and distant, and dawn here was a slow, gradual thing, the canopy brightening in stages like an enormous lamp being raised millimeter by millimeter. The earpiece finally rendered the Watcher's response as, "This arrangement implies a long-term presence of human settlers in proximity to the organism. This was not anticipated as part of our assessment protocol." "No," Marcus agreed. "It wasn't." Another pause. The Veth, Marcus was learning, were not cruel. This was important and easy to miss, because cruelty and the kind of comprehensive, confident wrongness the Veth had been practicing were not the same thing, and the difference mattered. Cruelty required enjoying the harm you caused. The Veth did not enjoy the harm they caused. They were not even entirely aware they were causing it, in the same way that a very large, very confident creature moving through a space that used to be someone else's home is not aware of the specific damage done by each footfall, because it has never had to pay attention to what its footfalls do to smaller things. What the Watcher was doing now, in the gray pre-dawn, processing the organism's terms, with its sensory cluster dimmed in the posture, the earpiece associated with genuine cognitive effort. It was not capitulating, it was recategorizing. And recategorization, for a mind that had been stable and certain. For as long as the Veth's minds were stable and certain, was not a small thing. It was, Marcus thought, possibly the hardest thing they had ever been asked to do. He waited. He was good at waiting. You learned that in the processing centers, too, the Watcher said. These terms are acceptable in principle. They require documentation and formal treaty execution with Veth authority, which will require time. How much time? Marcus asked. The earpiece processed. Approximately 8 of your standard months. The colony has 9 days before your final assessment. The Watcher's sensory cluster rotated slowly. The answer, when it came, was rendered with the kind of careful precision that indicated the Watcher was committing itself to a position it could not take back. The final assessment will be suspended pending treaty negotiations. Arvin Station will be considered provisionally sovereign territory of the forest organism for the duration of negotiation. Marcus let himself breathe. Thank you, he said. He was not sure the Veth had a word for that, but the Watcher's sensory cluster shifted toward him, not the way it had before, in the categorizing posture, the measuring posture, the posture of an assessor evaluating a specimen. It shifted with something Marcus did not have a word for either, though he thought about it often in the years that followed. Something between acknowledgement and surprise, and a third thing that had no name in any language he knew, the specific quality of attention that a very old, very certain mind produces when something unexpected happens, and it finds, to its own astonishment, that the unexpectedness is not unwelcome. Marcus spent the next 4 days in the forest, not because he needed to. The agreement was made, the clock was stopped, the colony was safe for now. He stayed because the organism asked him to, not in language, but in the way you ask someone who is finally in the right place to stay for a little while before the world reclaims them. The organism had things to show him. 60 million years of paying attention produces a great deal worth paying attention to, and the organism had apparently been looking for a reason to show someone for a very long time. It showed him civilizations, not in pictures, in resonance, in the kind of knowing that bypasses the visual cortex and lands directly in the part of the brain that processes pattern and meaning. Species that had found this forest and made contact with the organism. Species that had failed to make contact. Species that had tried the way the Veth had tried, with instruments and protocols and the prior certainty of what they expected to find, and received only silence in return. Species that had come with their own books, their own unresolved questions, their own inability to leave well enough alone, and found something alive in the root column's warmth that was interested in them, genuinely and without agenda. Because the unresolved question is the only interesting thing in the universe, and a mind that has run out of them has, in some important sense, run out of itself. He showed it things too. This was unplanned. The organism was curious. 60 million years of curiosity is an extraordinary force, patient and inexhaustible, and when it turned that curiosity toward the specific mind that had finally figured out how to talk to it, it asked questions, the way deepest roots ask questions. Thoroughly, going all the way to the bottom of everything. It wanted to know about the processing centers, about hydroponic bays that smelled of iron solution, about fathers who did not come home from survey missions, about what it felt like to be small enough to go unnoticed, to learn early that invisibility was a survival strategy, to spend years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, and then discover that the specific quality of your unremarkableness was the only possible key to a lock that had been waiting 60 million years to open. On the third day in the forest, sitting against one of the great root cables in a clearing where the light came through the canopy in shafts, so precisely angled they seemed deliberate, Marcus found that he was crying. Not dramatically, not with any particular grief he could name, the way you cry when something very old and very patient looks at you, without judgment, and without the specific evaluating attention that asks whether you are viable, whether you are worth the resources, whether you will survive or be relocated.
And what you feel in response to that kind of looking is something so unfamiliar that it has nowhere to go except out through the eyes.
The organism did not comment on this. It simply adjusted the rhythm of its pulse, very slightly, into a frequency that Markif's body recognized as comfort before his mind had a chance to decide whether comfort was appropriate. He slept, finally, on the third night, better than he had slept in years. He walked back through the forest on the fourth day and emerged from the tree line into the dome's pressurized airlock at 1600 Standard Time, 9 centimeters taller than when he had left. The medkit's measurements confirmed this, and Dr. Mern's expression when he walked into her office confirmed that the change was visible in ways that did not reduce to centimeters. He was wearing the same clothes. He had the same case clipped to the same pack with the same carabiner. He had the same narrow, unremarkable face and the same dark eyes that the Callisto processing centers had described. In the mandatory social development assessment he'd taken at 12, as demonstrates difficulty with direct eye contact in authority interactions. He looked Dr. Mern directly in the eye. "It worked," she said. "Better than worked," he said. The treaty negotiation lasted 11 months, not 8, because the Veth legal architecture required more revision than even the Watcher had anticipated. The organism, it turned out, had opinions about treaty language. Very precise opinions, conveyed through Marcus during sessions in the node's clearing, that the Veth legal team found deeply irregular, and that Marcus found, after the first few, unremarkable, because by then the organism's way of communicating had become as natural to him as reading, the warm resonance in his chest rising and falling in conversation with the old intelligence below the roots, in a dialogue that he was sometimes the translator for, and sometimes just the medium through which two very different kinds of mind found a common frequency. The Arvin Station population learned about the agreement 3 days after Marcus returned from the forest, when the Dome's administration board posted a notice that the assessment had been suspended pending new information. The notice did not explain what the new information was, or where it had come from, or that it had been obtained by a 16-year-old with a polymer case and a book that nobody fully understood. People in the Dome talked about it, the way people talk about a reprieve when they don't yet know what came before it, with relief that had not yet organized itself into comprehension. Marcus was not particularly interested in being understood. He was interested in the organism's terms being honored, which required sustained attention and a willingness to keep showing up to treaty sessions that the Veth conducted at a pace calibrated to their own processing speed, which was not fast by human standards. He attended every session. He did not miss one. When the Veth legal team members were replaced, as they were twice during the 11 months, he worked with the new members with the same patient, unhurried steadiness he had practiced since he was 9 years old in the processing centers, learning to hold the gaze of things that had power over you without blinking and without flinching and without ever giving them satisfaction of knowing exactly how afraid you were. He was afraid during those 11 months every day. The Veth enforcement vessels remained in the system. The assessment was suspended, but not closed. There were 3 separate occasions when the negotiation appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Once, when the Veth legal team introduced a sovereignty clause that would have effectively nullified the organism's person status. Once, when the Dome's administration board lost confidence in Marcus as a representative and tried to send an adult delegation in his place. And once, when a faction within the Dome itself, terrified and exhausted by 11 months of provisional everything, began circulating a petition to accept whatever terms the Veth offered and stop making things complicated. On the first occasion, Marcus caught the sovereignty clause before it was signed and sent it back to the Veth with a counter-proposal that had been drafted by him and refined through the root column's warmth by 60 million years of watching other civilizations make this exact mistake. The Veth accepted the counter-proposal after 8 days of deliberation. On the second occasion, he showed up to the administration board session with a recording of the Watcher's statement at the node, a statement the Veth had not objected to Marcus keeping, because the Veth did not lie about what they had said, and the recording was accurate, and played the section where the Watcher used the phrase provisionally sovereign territory of the forest organism, and said, "You can send whoever you want, but the organism chose me. If you want to explain to it why you've sent someone else, I'll translate." The board did not send anyone else. On the third occasion, the petition, the exhausted colony beginning to fold, Marcus went to the colony's main common area on a Thursday evening and sat at one of the long tables where the dome's residents ate their meals and talked about their lives. And he did not give a speech. He sat down with a bowl of something that tasted like reconstituted protein and starch, which it was, and he ate it. And when people came to sit near him, because people always come to sit near the person who seems to know what is happening, he answered their questions the best he could, not with certainty, not with false confidence, with the specific texture of someone who is doing the hardest thing they know how to do, and knows it is hard, and has decided to do it anyway. And the people who sat near him on those Thursday evenings went away with something that was not quite hope, and not quite reassurance, but was something more durable than either, the kind of steadiness you catch from other people, the way you catch warmth, by proximity, by staying close to the source. The petition failed for lack of signatures. The treaty was signed on a Tuesday in the 11th month. The signing ceremony took place in the clearing at the node, which the Veth legal team agreed to, because the organism had specified this as a term in the 9th revision of the signing protocol, and the Veth, by that point, had developed what Marcus privately considered a profound and slightly uncomfortable respect for the organism's precision about procedural matters. The treaty established the organism as a sovereign person. It established Arvin Station and any future human settlements within a specified radius as guests of the organism and therefore inviolate under Veth law. It established a joint consultative council, the only condition of which that Marcus had insisted on, personally and without compromise, was that the council would include at least one member below the age of 21 from the human community at all times, because the organism had been very clear with him, in the root column's warmth, about the value of minds that had not yet decided what everything was for. It also, in an appendix that the Veth legal team had not been expecting, and that took 3 weeks of additional negotiation to finalize, established a framework for the organism to introduce itself, formally and at its own discretion and on its own timeline, to other species in the galactic neighborhood who might benefit from the introduction. This had been the organism's idea. Marcus had conveyed it, and then sat back and let the Veth's legal team process it. The Watcher had said, after 2 days, the organism intends to become involved in interspecies diplomacy. Marcus had said, the organism has been watching interspecies diplomacy for 60 million years, and has some thoughts. The Watcher's sensory cluster had rotated slowly. Marcus had learned to read that rotation the way you learn to read a face. Not perfectly, not completely, but with the particular accuracy that comes from paying close attention to something for a long time. What the rotation said, he thought, was something like, "We did not anticipate this." "I know," Marcus had said. "That's kind of the point." He was 27 when he wrote the first account of what had happened in the forest and on the moon, the colonists still called the Green. He was 38 when he wrote the second one, better but still incomplete. He was 52 when he wrote the third, which was the one that got closest, and even then he ended it with a paragraph he was never satisfied with, because the thing he was trying to describe, the specific quality of the organism's attention, the warmth in the root column, the way a 60-million-year-old intelligence looked at a 16-year-old boy and found him sufficient, found him in fact the exact right thing for the exact moment required, did not have adequate language in any human tongue he knew of. He went back to the forest every year. Not because the organism required it. The organism's attention did not require maintenance the way human relationships do, because the organism's time sense was different enough from his that a year or a decade, registered as a brief interval in a conversation that was, from the organism's perspective, still just getting started. He went back, because the root column's warmth was the most honest thing he knew. Because nowhere else in the 23 systems he had visited, the 15 treaty negotiations he had participated in, the 40 years of work he had done, nowhere else did he feel as clearly the thing the organism had showed him on that third day in the forest, the thing that had made him cry in a clearing where the light came through the canopy at deliberate angles. He was not nothing. None of them were nothing. Not the people in the processing centers, not his mother who smelled of iron solution and exhaustion, not Selah or Rindu with her clipboard and her thermos walking out into an alien meadow, not the 4,000 people in the dome who had been 3 days from relocation to an unspecified somewhere. Not any of the small, frightened, stubborn, unremarkables who had gone into the woods when they were asked to, carrying tools they didn't fully understand, for people they'd never met, because the alternative was watching something wrong happen and not trying. He stood in the alcove one last time, the root tendrils warm against his palms, the deep sodalic pulse synchronizing, as it always did, with the specific rhythm of his own tired, aging, still going heart. He had grandchildren now. The oldest was 14. He had been thinking about her for days, thinking about how much she reminded him of a younger version of himself, the too quiet, too watchful quality she had, the way she held the gaze of things that made other people look away. He was going to show her the forest this summer. The organism had asked about her. Not in language, but in the way you ask about something. When you have been paying attention to the stories someone tells about their life and have been waiting patiently for the introduction. He thought about the watcher's sensory cluster, rotating slowly in the gray pre-dawn. He thought about the note in his pack, 3 sentences, "Don't stop when you're afraid." He thought about his father, who had not come home, and the hydroponic bays, and the assessment column that said, tendency towards historical pattern reinforcement, limited capacity for paradigm revision. He thought about what the Veth assessors had not understood, what they had perhaps, finally, after 40 years of updated assessment criteria and 3 revised frameworks and 17 formal treaty sessions, with the organism's joint consultative begun to understand that what looked from the outside like pattern reinforcement was from the inside, something entirely different. It was stubbornness, yes. It was the specific human inability to accept that a situation was final. It was the refusal to conclude from all available evidence that nothing could be done. But underneath that stubbornness, older than the stubbornness, the source of it, was something the organism had recognized from 60 million years of watching minds emerge and evolve and burn bright and go dark. In the long, patient dark of geologic time, something it had been waiting to find again. Genuine curiosity. The universe is large and old, and full of things that have decided what everything is for. It is very short on things that are still trying to figure it out. That shortage, the organism had conveyed in its slow root language way, was the single most important problem in the known galaxy, and the thing that made humans frightened, stubborn, unremarkable, historically pattern reinforcing, limited in paradigm revision, showing up with tools they didn't fully understand for people they'd never met. The thing that made them worth the trouble of a 60 million year wait was that they were, almost without exception, and against what seemed on some days, like all reasonable probability, still trying. Marcus pressed his palms flat against the warm roots and felt the old vast pulse sync with his, and stayed there for a while, in the forest that smelled like deep thyme and iron-rich soil, and something he had no word for. On the moon that the colonists still called the green, while outside the clearing, the light came through the enormous trees and shafts that were either deliberate or beautiful, and either way were reason enough to stay. The Veth had come in 3 waves, which was not how humans typically described the assessment, but was how Marcus would later describe it to his grandchildren when they were old enough to want to know the actual shape of what had happened. not the official shape. The first wave was the observation, 72 years of watching from a distance, gathering data, building models, running projections. The Veth were extraordinarily patient. They had a word in their primary language. The earpiece translated it approximately as temporal investment. That described the practice of spending vast amounts of time on something before acting, on the grounds that action taken without sufficient observation was not efficiency but waste. 72 years of temporal investment in humanity, watching every war and every treaty and every colony ship and every hydroponic bay, every Sela Orindu with her clipboard, and every child in a processing center, learning to make themselves small. The second wave was the assessment itself. Methodical, comprehensive, thorough in the way a very large net is thorough. It catches almost everything, and what it misses completely because it was not designed for that size of thing. The Veth assessors had arrived in their silica garments, with their sensory clusters, and their evaluation matrices, and their columns labeled organizational cohesion, technological trajectory, cultural adaptability, and they had gone from settlement to settlement, and dome to dome, and colony to colony, measuring and recording, and the humans they assessed had responded in the ways. Humans responded to being assessed by something larger and more powerful than themselves, some with defiance, some with accommodation, some with the specific performance of compliance that is not compliance at all, but a kind of strategic theater, and some, like the people in Arvin Station, with a quality the assessors noted in their formal reports as anxiety-driven paralysis, which was not entirely inaccurate, but missed the more important fact that underneath the anxiety was something very old and very stubborn that had not yet been given a reason to act. The third wave, the wave that Marcus had been a small, unremarkable, polymer case-carrying part of, was the enforcement phase. The classification of non-viable communities and the logistics of their relocation. This was the wave no one talked about in specific terms, because the specific terms were too heavy to carry in ordinary conversation. Marcus knew 3 people who had been relocated. They were alive. They were, by any measurable standard, physically safe. When they described their new situation, the words they used were careful and correct, and did not include anything that would have triggered a Veth review of his conversations with them, which was itself a kind of description. He thought about them often in the forest, those first days, walking northeast by compass through the violet-gray trees, while the root network pulsed under his boots, and the deep light came through the canopy in its sourceless green. He thought about the specificity of what was at stake, not an abstraction, not the fate of humanity in the large sense that made things easier to think about by making them too large to feel, but the 4,000 specific people in the dome behind him, people whose names he mostly did not know, but whose presence he had felt in the recycled air of that dome since the shuttle landed. The particular smell and sound and weight of a community that was afraid and did not want to leave. He thought about his mother. She had been relocated 2 years before from Callisto Station, which had received a final non-viable determination after the assessment team's third review. Marcus had not been there when it happened. He had been in transit, already moving toward the contact who would give him the case. Already set on the course that had led him here. She was safe. He called her on the system relays when the Veth weren't running signal sweeps. She did not ask him what he was doing because she had raised him to make his own decisions, and because she understood, without him saying it, that there were things he could not tell her, and that the not telling was its own kind of protection. He walked and thought about her, and let the forest be what it was around him. On the first night in the forest, he found a dry space between 2 massive roots, and ate the other half of his ration bar, and drank from his filter bottle, and sat with the book in his lap without opening it. The cover was warm in the same inexplicable way it had been warm at the table in Dr. Mern's office, a warmth that was not physical, but that his hands reported as physical, the body's persistent insistence on making sense of things through sensation, even when sensation is not quite the right tool. he thought about what the book was. Not what it contained. The analysts had told him what it contained, as much as they could determine, but what it was as an object. Someone or something had made it. Someone or something had written those pages in a script that predated every language Marcus knew about. Someone or something had then arranged for this book to be in the possession of a series of humans who had passed it carefully from hand to hand, across 3 generations, each of them knowing less about it than the one before, until it reached Dr. Tessely Mern, former professor of xenolinguistics, who had recognized what the script was not and spent 4 years working out the edges of what it might be, and who had eventually, with what Marcus suspected, was a combination of genuine brilliance and the specific recklessness of someone who has run out of cautious options, decided that the only way to find out was to send it into the forest, with someone who didn't know enough to be afraid of finding out he was afraid. He wanted to be clear about this, at least to himself, in the dark between the roots, with the forest pulse, moving through the ground and into his bones. He was very much afraid. The fear was not abstract. It was not going away. It sat in his chest, next inexplicable warmth, and the colony's weight, and the specific knowledge that he was 16 years old, and the only plan anyone had, and the plan was a book nobody could read, and a 16-year-old nobody had bothered to stop at the checkpoint. He had spent a long time, growing up, being ashamed of this quality, of being small enough not to be worth stopping, of being the kind of person whose unremarkableness was a defining feature. The processing centers did not traffic in kindness toward that kind of invisibility. The boys who were noticed, who were large and loud and confident, who took up space with their voices and their postures and their certainty about their own importance. Those boys moved through the centers with a friction that produced sparks, drama, recognition. Marcus had moved through them like smoke, and the smoke had been made of everything he had tried and failed to say, all the times he had watched something wrong happen and known the right words and not said them, because the right words from an invisible person are not heard. They are simply part of the background noise. He had not fully understood, until this moment, sitting between the roots in the dark, that the invisibility had been preparation, that all those years of learning to read silence, to navigate the spaces where the large and loud and confident were not looking, to be precisely unremarkable at exactly the right moments. It had all been, without anyone designing it, a kind of education. The organism had been waiting for a mind that was genuinely unencumbered. He had been made unencumbered by circumstance. The circumstance was not kind, and it was not fair, and it had cost him and his mother, and everyone he knew something real, but it had made him the exact shape required. He did not find this comforting exactly. He found it interesting, which was, he would come to understand how the organism felt about almost everything. He fell asleep to the pulse of the forest, and woke to the green pre-dawn light, with his hand still resting on the book's cover, and a clarity in his head that he had not had the night before. The way sleep sometimes solves the problems you were carrying, when you lay down the simple process of removing the exhaustion that was making them unsolvable. He kept walking. The second day brought the markers and the first true communication, but it also brought the fog. Silvera 4's atmosphere had weather systems driven by the enormous temperature differential between its sun-facing and dark-side hemispheres, and the deep forest channeled the resulting pressure gradients in ways that produced, every few days, a ground fog so dense it reduced visibility to 3 meters and transformed the route network into a labyrinth of half-seen cables emerging from white nothing. Marcus walked through it for 4 hours by compass, unable to see more than a few routes ahead, unable to hear more than the fog-muffled pulse of the forest and his own breathing, and the experience was either the most frightening thing that had happened to him since landing or a gift, depending on how you looked at it, because in the fog you could not plan, and you could not strategize, and you could not build a mental map of where you were going. You could only go. He found the first marker in the fog. His boot touched the edge of the braided root node before he saw it. and he stopped and crouched and put his hands on it, and felt the vibration travel up his arms. And the vibration was different from the background pulse. More complex, layered, the way music is layered, when you go from hearing it in a distant room to hearing it with your ear against the wall. He understood, without knowing how, that the marker was a word, not a human word, a forest word, a word made of growth rather than sound, and the meaning he received from it was something like, "You are going the right way." He put his hand on the next marker and got, "You are not alone." He put his hand on the third marker. In a space where the fog was thinning into shafts of diffuse morning light, and got something that was less a word than a sensation. The feeling of being looked at, not the Veths categorizing attention, not the processing center assessors evaluating attention, but the attention of something that was genuinely interested in the answer to the question of who you were. Attention without agenda. He had not known there was a thing that could be conveyed through warm wood and vibration and the specific quality of a 60-million-year-old intelligence, paying careful, patient attention to a small creature it had been waiting a very long time to meet. He sat with his hands on the marker for a long time. The fog finished dissipating around him. The forest was green and vast and quiet, and the route network ran in every direction, like a city seen from above, all its roads leading somewhere. He got up and kept walking. What Marcus did not know, walking northeast through the forest, was that he was not the first person the book had been given to who had tried to reach the node. There had been two others, both adults, both significantly more prepared than Marcus in every conventional sense. The first, a xenolinguist who had worked with Dr. Mern for 3 years developing the initial translation framework, had turned back on the second day, not from fear, but from something more difficult, the specific paralysis of a person who knows too much about what they are looking for, and therefore cannot experience what they are, finding every sensation filtered through the mesh of prior knowledge until what reaches the core is not the thing itself, but a version of the thing that has already been classified. The organism had not been unkind. It had simply not responded. The absence was not rejection. It was, as Marcus would later understand, a kind of patient waiting for the right frequency. The second person had reached the clearing, had stood in front of the root column for 2 hours, had pressed their hands to the braided tendrils and waited and felt nothing, or felt something and not known what to do with it, and gone back to the dome with a technical report that accurately described the biometric and electromagnetic characteristics of the node interface, and said nothing whatsoever about warmth or pulse, or the experience of being looked at without agenda. The report had been useful. It had told Dr. Mern that the interface required something the report could not name, which had led her, eventually, to the specific and unusual decision, give the book to a 16-year-old boy who had expressed, in response to her query about his qualifications for the mission, the following: "I don't have any qualifications. I've never done anything like this. I don't know what I'm supposed to find. I just know I'll go." She had looked at him for a long time after that. He had looked back at her, steadily, the way he had learned in the processing centers. She had given him the book. The clearing where Marcus first opened the book was a place the forest made by having 3 of its enormous trees fall in some long ago event, their trunks still present as vast horizontal forms, slowly being reclaimed by moss and smaller growth, their absence from the canopy, creating a gap through which the light came down in a column Marcus would have described as holy if he had the kind of background that gave the word its charge, and instead described in his first account as the only light he had ever seen that seemed to know it was being looked at. He sat on the nearest fallen trunk and opened the book to a page that was not the first page, but felt like the first page, in the way some doors that are not the front door feel more like the real entrance than the official one. The script was there, dense and particular, and as he looked at it, the shift happened. He had asked Dr. Mern to describe the shift. She had said, based on the second candidate's report, there is a reorganization of perceptual priority. What you have been backgrounding becomes foreground. What you have been attending to becomes peripheral. That was accurate. What Marcus experienced was that the forest pulse, which he had been processing as background since he entered the tree line, suddenly occupied the center of his attention, and everything else, his visual field, the weight of his pack, the ache in his feet from 2 days of walking, the constant low-level fear, moved to the edges, and at the center, the pulse was not just a rhythm. It was structured. It was complex in the way that language is complex, in the way that the most compressed and elegant expression of a very large idea is complex, carrying more information per unit than it appears to, until you slow down and let it speak at its own pace. The first sequence in the book was a greeting in the sense of recognition. He made the sounds the book directed his body to make. The sounds were not comfortable. His vocal apparatus was not designed for them, and produced them through some combination of effort and surrender, the way you learn to make sounds in a foreign language, by getting out of the way of the process and trusting the muscle memory before the intellectual memory has caught up. The forest paused. Not completely. The leaves still moved. The distant sounds of whatever fauna occupied the higher canopy were still present. The root network still pulsed. But the pause was real, the specific quality of attention shifting from diffuse to focused, from ambient to personal. Something very large turned its attention toward something very small, and the very small thing held its ground on a fallen tree, in a column of deliberate light, and waited. The response came as warmth and rhythm and the sensation of being looked at without agenda, and Marcus sat with it for a long time before he got up and kept walking. He reached the clearing with the node at 0247 by his watch, 2 hours before dawn, and the watcher was there. He had known the watcher might be there. Dr. Mern had told him, based on the signal intelligence the dome's admin team had been able to gather from the Veth's sensor network. The assessment team leader had been making periodic visits to the node clearing. The frequency had increased in the last 30 days. Whatever the watcher was waiting for, it was close. What Marcus had not expected was the quality of the watcher's stillness. The Veth at rest were always still in a way that human stillness was not. Human stillness was an achieved thing, a discipline over the body's constant impulse toward motion. Veth stillness was structural, inherent, the resting state of a physiology that treated motion as deliberate rather than default. But the watcher's stillness in that clearing was something additional, a depth of arrested attention that Marcus, standing at the clearing's edge in the pre-dawn dark, recognized as he had recognized it only once before in his life. In his mother, the night they got the official confirmation that his father's survey mission had been lost, when she had sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours, with her hands flat on the surface, and her eyes open, and her body so completely still that the movement of her breathing seemed like an accident. The watcher was waiting for something it had been waiting for a very long time, and it was afraid the wait was about to end in a way it had not planned for. Marcus recognized the fear because he knew what fear looked like when it had been made very small and very still by a long time of careful, professional management. He recognized it because he had been making his own fear small and still since he was 9 years old. The watcher's fear was different in its specifics. It was the fear of a very large thing that has planned for most contingencies and is now encountering one it had not planned for, but the shape of it was familiar. He felt, unexpectedly, something that was not quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. He walked into the clearing. The Veth sensory clusters rotated toward him. He did not hesitate. He walked to the root column, set his pack down beside it, unclipped the case, opened it, and took out the book. Then he stood in the alcove and let the root tendrils find his hands. What happened in the root column he has already attempted to describe. What has not yet been described is what the Veth did while it was happening. They watched. All 3 of them, sensory clusters, fully active, running every scan their technology permitted on the 16-year-old boy, standing in the alcove with his eyes closed and his hands pressed flat against warm braided roots. And what they recorded what their instruments measured, what their assessment treatises processed and filed and cross-referenced, was this: a human child below the age of majority, with no formal credentials and no organizational standing, and a biometric signature that was not yet in the standard registry, in active, two-way communication with an entity of indeterminate age and classification. And the entity was responding, not as it had responded to the Veth's 3,000 years of technological approaches, with silence, with everything, with the specific quality of full and genuine engagement that the Veth's entire history of attempting to access the node had never once produced. The Watcher stood in the pre-dawn gray and processed this for the full duration of Marcus's time in the alcove, which was 47 minutes, and when Marcus stepped out of the alcove and turned to face them and said, "You need to leave," the Watcher had been processing for 47 minutes and had arrived at a place it had not anticipated. Uncertainty. The Veth did not do well with uncertainty. Their entire civilization, their legal frameworks, their assessment protocols, their approach to every new species they encountered, all of it was built on the premise that sufficient observation produced sufficient certainty, and sufficient certainty produced appropriate action, and appropriate action maintained the stability of the known galactic neighborhood in a way that was good for everyone who was part of the known galactic neighborhood, and neutral for everyone who was not. The premise had served them well. It had served them well for a very long time. It had never, in a very long time, produced a result like this, a 47-minute communication between their most studied non-human and a juvenile human, who was not interesting enough to be in their registry. You need to leave. The Watcher thought about the full depth of its records on human behavior. It thought about the assessment column labeled Cultural Adaptability and the annotation that read, Tendency toward Historical Pattern Reinforcement, and it thought about how that annotation had been written with the confidence of 72 years of temporal investment in the study of a species, and it thought about the specific pattern it was currently observing, which did not fit the annotation, and did not fit any pattern in its records, and fit instead something the Watcher had not looked at in a very long time, because it had believed itself to be past the stage of encountering things it had no framework for. It said carefully and precisely, "What terms does the forest require for peaceful cooperation?" Marcus asked the organism. The organism considered. Marcus relayed. The terms took 3 hours to fully articulate, not because they were complex, but because each term required Marcus to serve as a translator between two kinds of mind that had very different assumptions about what words were for. The organism, for whom language was an imprecise tool used to gesture at realities that were most accurately expressed in the direct exchange of resonance and biological chemistry, and the Veth, for whom language was a precise instrument used to construct binding frameworks with minimum interpretive ambiguity. Marcus sat between them in the gray lightning morning and thought about his xenolinguistics secondary module from Callisto Station Secondary, which he had taken because it was the only elective that did not require equipment he didn't have access to, and thought that Dr. Mern would find this very funny. The Watcher took notes, actual written notes, in the Veth's angular script, pressed into a surface it produced from one of its garment's layers. This was remarkable because the Veth had recording technology that made written notes redundant. Marcus understood that the Watcher was writing notes for the same reason. Humans wrote notes when they were processing something difficult. The physical act of transcription slowed the mind to a pace that let it catch up with what was being learned. When the terms were complete, the Watcher read them back, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. The Veth habit of recapitulation before formal agreement, the verbal equivalent of tying a double knot. Marcus listened to the recapitulation and caught two places where the organism's meaning had been slightly compressed in translation, and corrected them, and the Watcher made additional notes, and read those back as well. Then the Watcher asked a question Marcus had not anticipated. It said, The organism selected this particular human to interface with. Is this selection permanent? Marcus looked at the root column. He pressed his hand briefly against the bark and received an impression that was not quite an answer and not quite laughter, but was somewhere in the warm space between them. He said to the watcher, "The organism selects who it selects. That's not part of the treaty terms." The watcher's sensory cluster shifted. A pause, then understood. The sun had fully risen by then. Silvara IV's small, distant sun, lighting the clearing in the flat, diffuse way that made everything look both very real and very old. The roots were wet with dew. The organism's pulse was steady and unhurried. The three Veth stood in the clearing like things that had been there for a while, and were making the adjustment to the fact that they would not be there forever. Marcus stood in the morning light, with his case open and his book inside it, and thought about 4,000 people in a dome, behind the tree line, who did not yet know that their timeline had just changed. He thought about his mother in her new settlement, flat hands on a table, waiting. He thought about Sela Orindu, clipboard and thermos, walking out into the meadow. He thought, "We are, I think, the strangest thing in the galaxy. And I think the galaxy might need us for exactly that reason." He clipped the case back to his pack and began the walk home. The walk back took 3 days and was different in every way from the walk in. On the walk in, Marcus had been carrying the weight of the case and the weight of what was at stake and the weight of the very specific loneliness of being the only plan available. He had been walking toward something unknown, through a forest that was paying attention to him in ways he could feel but not name, with fear settled in his chest, like a stone he had decided to carry rather than put down, because putting it down would require pretending the fear wasn't reasonable when it absolutely was. On the walk back, the stone was still there. The fear had not resolved into certainty, because the Watcher's provisional agreement was not the same thing as the completed treaty, and the completed treaty was not the same thing as 4,000 people being permanently and truly safe, and the long chain of contingencies that stood between where he was now and where he needed to be was long and full of the kinds of links that could break under pressure. He knew this, he was carrying it, but underneath the weight there was the warmth. The organism's resonance had not ended when he stepped out of the alcove. He had thought it would, that the contact was a bounded event, a switch that turned on and off at the interface. It was not. It was more like the way your ear adjusts to a sound. You do not stop hearing the sound. When you move away from its source, you carry the adjusted hearing with you, and ordinary sounds take on new qualities through the altered instrument. He was not receiving communication. The organism was not speaking to him as he walked. But its attention was present in the way the warmth in the roots was present, the way the pulse he could feel through the soles of his boots was present. Not loudly, not insistently, but continuously, a confirmation that the contact was real, and the terms were real, and he was not, as he had sometimes feared during the first walk, constructing all of this out of the specific hallucination produced by a frightened, sleep-deprived adolescent who wanted too badly for there to be a way through. He stopped at the first marker on the way back and pressed his palm against it. And the vibration gave him something he translated as, "Well done." He laughed, actually laughed, alone in the forest, which was something he had not expected to do, and which felt, in the moment, like one of the more important things he had done in the last week. He kept walking. The dome's outer pressure seal was visible from 1/2 kilometer away in the pre-afternoon light, the dome's transparent upper sections, catching the small sun and throwing it back as a curved gleam against the forest's violet gray. Marcus stopped at the tree line for a moment and looked at it. The dome was not beautiful, architecturally. It was a functional structure, built for pressurization and thermal regulation, and the specific needs of 4,000 people, trying to make a life in a place that had not been built for human life. It had none of the grandeur of the old Earth cities in the archives, none of the deliberate aesthetic ambition of the newer colony designs. It was a dome. It kept the atmosphere in, and the cold out and the people inside it alive. It was the most important thing Marcus had ever seen. He went in through the outer pressure seal and walked through the decontamination sequence and emerged into the dome's inner corridors and made his way to Dr. Mern's office, and she was there, at her desk, in the same chair she had been in when he left, and she was not sleeping. She had the focused inward look of a person who has been doing continuous calculations for 4 days and has arrived at the point where the calculations are the only thing keeping the fear manageable. She looked up when he came in. He said, "It worked." She closed her eyes. He watched her process it, the way the tension left her shoulders in stages, not all at once, but in the specific sequential release of muscles that have been held tight for so long they have to remember how to let go one by one. Then she opened her eyes and said, "Tell me everything." So he did. It took 4 hours. She asked good questions, precise, clinically framed. The xenolinguist habit of parsing each piece of information for its structural implications before moving on. He answered them as accurately as he could, knowing that accuracy, in this case, was complicated by the fact that a significant portion of what had happened was not accurately renderable in language, because it had happened below language, in the register of resonance in biological chemistry, and the organism's way of communicating that bypassed the verbal cortex entirely. He told her about the clearing and the column in the Watcher. He told her about the terms. He told her about the Watcher's written notes and the recapitulation. And the moment when the pre-dawn gray had lightened into morning while they worked out the final language of the provisional agreement. He told her about the organism's question, the one embedded in the resonance of the root, column contact, the one it had posed not in words, but in the patient deep language of attention, turned full and complete toward a small, frightened, unencumbered mind standing in an alcove with its hands pressed flat against warm wood. He told her it had asked why he came. Dr. Mern said, "What did you tell it?" Marcus said, "I didn't have to tell it. It read it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "And what did it read?" He thought about the answer for a while. The ration bar taste was in his mouth still, and his feet ached from 3 days of walking. And through the office's small window, he could see the dome's common corridor, where a few people were moving between sections, with the distracted purpose of people who did not yet know that the weight they had been carrying was about to be lifted. Not completely, but enough to breathe. He said, "It read that I came because the alternative was watching something wrong happen and not trying. And it read something underneath that, which I didn't know was there until it showed it to me." "What was that?" she said. He thought about the clearing where the light came through at the angle that was either deliberate or beautiful. He thought about his mother's flat hands on the table. He thought about the long years of invisibility that had felt like waste and had turned out to be preparation. "That I wanted to," he said. "Not just because I had to, because I was curious, because I didn't know what was in the forest and I wanted to find out. Because whatever else is true about humans, we are, most of us, most of the time, people who want to know what's in the forest." Dr. Mern was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "And the organism considered that sufficient." "The organism," Marcus said, "considered it more than sufficient. The organism considered it exactly what it had been waiting for." The dome's administration board was informed of the provisional agreement the following morning in a session that Marcus attended and mostly observed, because the board members had questions that Dr. Mern was better equipped to answer, and the only questions Marcus felt truly competent to answer were the ones nobody asked in formal sessions. The ones about what it felt like to stand in the clearing in the gray pre-dawn and say you need to leave to something that had the power to end 4,000 lives and have it listen. The board declared a rest day, which meant the dome's common areas were more crowded than usual, and the recycled air had the specific quality it got when people were processing relief. Warmer somehow, softer around the edges, full of the sounds of conversations that were not about anything urgent, because the urgent thing had temporarily receded, and people were remembering what it felt like to talk about other things. Marcus sat in the common area for most of the afternoon and drank bad coffee and was, for the first time in weeks, genuinely unhurriedly still. A girl sat across from him at one point, maybe 12 years old, with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had been attending very closely to the adults around her during the assessment period and had formed her own views about what was happening. She looked at him with the direct, evaluating look of someone who has not yet learned to disguise their assessment of other people, the look children have before they acquire the social smoothing that teaches you to make your curiosity less visible. She said. "You went into the forest," he said. "Yes," she said. "Was it scary?" He considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer, and she was clearly the kind of person who would notice if she got a diplomatic non-answer instead. "Yes," he said, "almost the whole time, but you kept us." She thought about this. Then she said, "Why?" He thought about how to say it in a way that was true, and also in a way that a 12-year-old with careful, watchful eyes would find useful rather than abstract. He thought about the organism and the warmth in the roots, and the markers saying, "You are going the right way. You are not alone." He thought about the specific quality of being looked at without agenda. He said, "Because I was curious, and because 4,000 people needed someone to go." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded, with the gravity of someone filing information in a place they will come back to, and got up and went back to wherever she had been going. Marcus watched her go and thought, "There it is, right there. That's what it is." He finished his coffee and thought about the treaty that had not yet been signed, and the enforcement vessels that were still in the system, and the long, careful work that remained. And he thought about his mother and the organism and Dr. Mern's 4 years of working out the edges of what the book might be, and he thought about Sela Orindu one more time, the way he always came back to her in moments of reckoning, her clipboard and her thermos and her audited morning. And he thought, we are the strangest, most inconvenient, most persistently curious creatures that have ever found their way to the stars. And, whatever else the universe turns out to be, it is going to have to deal with the fact that we showed up, and we are not, under any circumstances. Done asking questions, he got up and went back to work.